letters from Paul. We just say we just have one letter here. And scholars, in fact, argue as to whether it's one letter or it's fragments from multiple letters. And so some have suggested that there are as many, not necessarily that they're on chapter breaks, but there are as many as four letters that are represented by the kind of the shifts in topic that Paul has. That maybe they're excerpts from different letters. Or maybe he's just referring to the other letters, like the letters to the church at Ephesians, the letters to the church at Colossae. Maybe that's the thing that he's reminding them of, is be aware of the things that Paul has written, but it could refer to multiple letters. An ongoing relationship, I guess, is what I'm leaning to here. Do you remember how the church, how did Paul come into the acquaintance of the church at Philippi? It's not part of the lesson, just testing your memory on what you may remember about the book, or it may be even about the history in Acts. How did church come to be? How did Paul come to be in Philippi? Joe?
He found some ladies worshiping at the river and worshiped with them, converted them. That's where it started. And he ended up in jail, ended up converting the jailer, his family.
Okay. Okay, and that's actually made mention of that in the lesson, to those humble beginnings. Does anyone recall how did Paul leave Antioch or leave Jerusalem with the intention of going to Philippi? Was that on his list? What was the occasion for Paul to be at Philippi, if that wasn't the intention? You may remember in the second missionary journey, he was visiting the churches that he established at the first missionary journey and encouraging them. And he specifically wanted to go to Lystra to pick up a certain favorite that he had there, a certain disciple named Timothy that he wanted to travel with him. But was his intention to go across the ocean to Macedonia? Why did he go? Saw a vision, received a vision. Matter of fact, even before he received that vision, he was hindered. He had intended to go into Asia, and the Spirit said, "Not today. That's not what I want you to do." And he said, "Well, then we'll just go down the coast, go to Bithynia." And the Spirit said, "That's not what we got in mind." And so that kind of left going straight to the coast. So that when we got to Troas, he received a vision of a man telling him to come to Macedonia. Now, how? I don't know what was in that vision. That's all really Luke tells us about it. I don't know how you would recognize a Macedonian. Maybe he wore purple, That was Lydia's trade, right? As a seller of purple. Maybe there's something distinctive about his language, but he knew from this vision that the Spirit intended for him to go across the water to Macedonia. And so I don't think that it was part of his master plan. He intended to go to bring the gospel to places that hadn't been visited before, but I don't know that Philippi was on his list. It was a significant Roman colony, significant Gentile presence, not a very significant Jewish presence. So it really didn't fit the mold where he went to various villages in the New World or in the first century world, and he would go to the synagogues to try to find believers in God and begin conversing with them from the Scriptures about the Messiah. And Philippi may not have fit that mold very well. It may not have been on his radar up to that point. But the Spirit made it plain. That's what the Spirit wanted him to do, and that was the occasion for him to go to Philippi and make these conversions that Joe referred to. Very humble beginning. It's not like the church came from the synagogue. It was really outside of it. There wasn't a synagogue to build on. And you would think of a merchant and a household and a converted jailer. Would you, if you heard that was if somebody went to Puerto Rico and established a church today from a merchant and her family and a jailer, would you be excited about the prospects? Well, we ought to be. I would be excited about the prospects when anyone is converted. But you might think they're going to have a rough road to hoe, won't they? They're going to have a difficult time ahead of them. But yet Paul, the Spirit, knew what it was doing. And as a result, this church was formed, and it continued to be strong. It continued to have associations with Paul. Long term, as I said, up to probably a decade or so now. in which they have supported each other. Paul's remembering them in his prayers. They're remembering Paul in his prayers. And you see this, these various signs of maturity, I think even as the letter progresses, that illustrate what the gospel has done to these in the lives of these people at Philippi. Let's read starting at 14. Let's read this section going through the end of the chapter. Is there someone who'd like to read that for us? Thank you, Bethany. There's so much in these few paragraphs that are particularly, and this resonated with me because it's not been very long. Matter of fact, just last week that we had lessons in koinonia. And koinonia shows up multiple times in this passage. When Paul says, "It was kind of you to share in my trouble." That's what we're looking for. That's the fellowship word that we studied last week and Ralph's lessons. That also that no church in verse 15 entered into partnership with me in giving and receiving. That's our koinonia. That's the word that we've been studying. And here Paul, that's the hallmark of his association with. Obviously, there's affection. They have history, but this partnership that they've begun on Paul's second missionary journey is continuing to be fruitful, continuing to be beneficial to both of them. And that Paul's basically talking about that in almost a casual way here, that he mentions it, and he mentions it repeatedly. It's something that they recognize that that's something that he wants to remind them of, and it would be of their benefit. And that's one of the first hallmarks, one of these first marks of the growing church, is they haven't lost their affection for the gospel. They have this passion for hearing gospel preaching and supporting gospel preaching. They like it. They like receiving it firsthand. They like providing it for others. They recognize that the power is really in the Word. That no matter how well it's presented, no matter how much preparation is made, no matter how well the preacher may have studied, the real power, the real converting power is in the message, is in the Word itself. And that's where the Spirit does the work. No matter who does the planting, no matter who does the watering, no matter who does the nurturing, that power is in the message. And getting that message out is the first and most important step. Now, it's not the only step. That doesn't say that all you've done, after you've ensured that the gospel is faithfully preached, that you're done. There's still work to be done. But you can't enjoy success. You can't enjoy the kind of fruitfulness in the kingdom without first putting in that effort, without laying that groundwork. And a respect for that power and maybe even, I don't know what state they were in terms of numbers of memberships and the makeup of the church at Philippi at the point of Paul's writing this letter to them. But I suspect it's not just a few families anymore. It's enough. They have enough means to have had a partnership with Paul to send to him almost immediately as he worked his way down the coast into Thessalonica and Berea and into Greece and ultimately to Corinth. They had fellowship with him. Paul makes mention in the Corinthian letter of having robbed other churches so that he could preach to them. And the Philippians, I think, are among that number. That they're the ones that are ensuring that the gospel is continuing to spread in their part of the world, and not just within their borders. And that affection for, that desire to see the gospel spread, and understanding that it's going to take not only the willingness of someone like Paul and his companions to go, but they're also going to have to provide for their means. They're going to have to be supported in doing that work. not merely just keeping body and soul together and making sure that they get their shoes replaced as they're walking from places, but also that they have the means to be able to make plans to go to other places as well. That deeper part of that partnership is I think illustrated here, and the fact that Paul makes mention of the folks in Macedonia for their financial support, and to the Corinthians and in other places, I believe, but specifically the folks in Macedonia for their example of having given themselves to the Lord first, that they understood, embraced the challenge to go to the world and preach the gospel. Even if you can't go firsthand, even if you're not in a position to be able to drop what you're doing and go on the road to begin preaching the gospel, that you can have fellowship with someone who does. If you're of a mind to, if you're thinking far enough ahead, you realize and value this work, then you'll participate. You can participate and have fellowship, even like Paul is, and referring to the Corinthians, to the Philippians here. I think that it's notable that it's something to keep an eye on at the places that you are worshiping, is how much of the effort, how much of the finances that you have that you can expend toward the church, the spreading of the gospel. That could just be providing the class materials and preachers and the building and facilities and things like that where you are locally, but it's not limited to just the borders here in the building, just the property line, as it were. That's not the only place in which we can have an impact in spreading the gospel. And the Philippians have demonstrated that, so much so that they were used as an example in other places in the scriptures. I like that, and I said I like especially after Ralph's lesson to be able to follow up with these fellowship passages, these mentions of koinonia, very, very early on in this particular lesson, because it reminds us how rich a topic that is and how important it is that we adopt that attitude as a group, but also individually. No matter how if you're not really bought into that, said, well, some of those people I worship with are crazy about supporting other people, and that's on their mind all the time. They're mentioning their prayers all the time, and I'm kind of on it. That's not that we're really this passage, I think, is inviting. The example is that you probably should develop some more enthusiasm for it. That it should be something that you have a deep concern in, not only for the souls that the gospel, the message touches, but also in the benefits that come to you as a result of that. That for the sacrifices that we make, in being able to support these other men and use a portion of our contribution, our treasury to be able to support people that are preaching the gospel in other places is something that we benefit in. We shouldn't just think about, well, that's just money spent and we'll never see any return from. That it's the returns from it are literally being credited to the Philippians as Paul's going out and preaching and converting other people. And that's not that we're keeping score, not that there's a ledger there, but Paul uses the language about crediting the account to help you understand about the benefit. And we ought to have an attitude like Paul's been talking about earlier in the book, where this is something that's important to us, that we derive joy from this, knowing that the gospel is being preached, that we're helping other people hear the gospel message, and that message, that power can be exercised on them after they've heard it. We ought to take some comfort in that. That ought to please us on some level, don't you think? Otherwise, I'd say that if we are not to the state that we find joy in that pleases us, that we're happy about that's something that we need to work on. We need to broaden our perspective on what our expectations are about our relationship with the Lord. Because He, I believe, expects us to take delight in this. He expects us. This ought to be a source of the joy that we find in our service to Him. Our author makes mention about, doesn't use this word exactly, but how many servants in the kingdom are kind of trudging along on their way to heaven, as opposed to having a joyful walk, maybe even a march. We've got a song that we're marching to Zion. We may not sing it like it's a march, but you might imagine that we're a group and we're marching to our destinations, not to slink in the back door, but we're marching right up to the gate with the expectation of being welcomed, being recognized. And we're marching to lift our spirits along the way, to help us with our cadence, to do that left, right, to help to keep the body moving forward. And we oughtn't to be dragging along. We oughtn't to be just trudging along, seeing this well, I got to go to church again. They're going to be expecting me, and if I don't go, somebody's going to call and bug me about it. We need to get out of that mindset. We need to get into the mindset that Paul's describing here with this relationship with the Philippians, who are pleased to have fellowship and the local work and works beyond that, because the gospel is being preached and souls are being exposed to the gospel and being given the opportunity for salvation. That doesn't motivate you that may not be the first thing that motivates you when you think about it's the first day of the week, or even to I need to do my Bible reading today, or I need to study for the lesson. That may not be a motivation to you, but we ought to keep it at hand. If we can keep that thought nearby to spring on, I think we can come close to having this kind of relationship. Paul here describes not just getting by and paying the bills kind of relationship, not just meeting expectations. Paul here describes an abounding relationship, doesn't he? I mean, not just in this superlative that he has at the end, to our Father, in verse 20, to our God and Father be glory forever and ever. Amen. The author makes him. He could have just stopped. To our Father be the glory, and that would have been a fine sentence by itself. But he piles on, forever and ever. Not just forever, but then ever beyond that, which can you even think that far ahead. And amen. So say we all to that. This relationship that he's talking about here, seeking not only the continued fellowship because it will help Paul in his circumstances, but it also because of the credit that goes to the Philippians for participating in that, and not just doing without and character building. If you think about, and there's reference here about this gift in verse 18. A fragrant offering, a sacrifice acceptable and pleasing to God. What does that remind you of? Is that familiar to you? I hope. Hazel's nodding. What's that remind you of? Exactly. I think that's exactly and these folks they probably would have heard of that about Old Testament sacrifices to God from somebody like Paul. Not being Gentiles, they probably wouldn't have had that background, been taught, Jews were taught to read oftentimes in the synagogue. That's the way they learned their language, from the scriptures. And so they would have had those stories, the sacrifices. The story of Noah, for instance, has exactly this phrase in it. When Noah finally landed on dry land, you may recall that he took of the clean animals and made a burnt offering to God. And it uses this same phrase about this sacrifice, this odor, this aroma that was pleasing to God. So it goes way, way back. It's not merely, well, technically that's Old Testament too, but it's not merely the old law. It's not just the Mosaical law and all the rules about sacrifice. This has been a hallmark, a characteristic of God's people, dating back even to the flood. And that's that kind of sacrifice. Before I rant, I'll give Jerry the floor. Jerry, that's Jerry. And that's not going to make the point I was about to make, but they are presented in that way. That our prayers, that worship, that mental assent that we need God and we honor God through our prayers. You think about in our prayers, are we really, is it an information exchange? Are you telling God anything that he doesn't already know? Or that he could know if he wanted? If that bothers you? It's not like he's waiting for our news, to complete its day. What kind of day did you have? What did you learn at school today? Kind of moment. It's not like he doesn't already know that, but what he didn't know is maybe our heart's devotion to him and our mindset that knows that we're dependent upon him. And that we want to give him glory in all that we do. Then when we express that is that odor. That it's like the incense that they burn in the temple that's offered up as a metaphor for the worship to God. But the idea of the sacrifice, when you think of an Old Testament and in sacrifice, particularly the burnt offering, The characteristics of that are that it's something that we provide, that the petitioner provides to God. But what use does the petitioner have of the sacrifice after it's made? Well, none, really, right? That's part of what makes it a sacrifice, is you're surrendering it. Even if it's not a burnt offering, if it were a drink offering, the drink offering, you may recall that's you could take something that was liquid, I think oil or wine, and then it would be poured out on the ground. Well, what use of it is it any more use to you? You didn't even get to select where they poured it out. They didn't even put it on the compost heap where it might, that might have been of some use to you. It's the surrender that makes it the sacrifice. Now, there were some sacrifices that God allowed portions of to go to the benefit of the priest, but they didn't benefit the petitioner. It's not like a potluck where you take your favorite dish and you prepare that and you bring it so that everyone else can share it, but you get to have a serving or two as well, and you get the leftovers, right? It's not like that. It's not like that you're continuing to get benefit from that sacrifice, at least material benefit, but you surrender it. You give it up, which is what the Macedonians did, what the Philippians did when they sent and supported Paul in this fact. They surrendered that to Paul's use. They did without so that Paul could have what he needed. And Paul recognizes that. He says that not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that increases to your credit. He concedes that this is a gift. This is unearned benefit to me. I'm in your debt. I'm in your graces. You have provided for me. You've given it and surrendered this for my benefit. And he acknowledges that here. And that's part of that part. Paul may be providing the elbow grease, as it were, the shoe leather to go from place to place, but he's able to do that by benefit of people like the Philippians that are contributing to his need. And that closes the partnership loop. And Paul piles all that onto this very brief summary of their relationship, at least that financial aspect of it, in this particular passage. He didn't talk about, although I think it's probably there as a background, he didn't talk specifically about how cheerfully they're doing this. They at least recognize the obligation. They're willing to continue doing it after so much time. And I can't do them. I can't do all the prove to you empirically that this is a decade-long relationship, perhaps longer even. But it appears to me from the history of the scriptures, from when the church was established in Philippi and when we think that this is occurring, when Paul is imprisoned at Rome, that's a significant period of time. And they're still on speaking terms. They're still nurturing this partnership that began so long ago. Joe? Even though we aren't the first-hand recipients of the letter, we, in fact, generations later, in a different time, in a different place on the globe, are in fact benefiting from the strength of that relationship. It's an excellent point. And that's what he talks about in verse 17, not the gift, but the fruit that will increase to their credit. And that's really a global, that's really looking at the big view, right? That's not looking at the quarterly results. That's the long game. That's the long view. But Paul here refers to that and almost casually. And he even talks about, I think in verse 18, I've received full payment and more. I'm well supplied, having received from Epaphroditus the gift you sent. Well supplied reminds you of what we talked about last week about having learned to get by, learning to be content, learning to thrive, whether we've got much or we've got little. Paul here, though, says that he's not just scrimping by. He's well supplied. But we know that he's learned to be able to make do with what he's got. He's already referred to that. But this suggests an exceedance of that. That the Philippians aren't just interested in Paul getting the minimum, they want to exceed that. And that suggests generosity, that suggests their affection for him. And that's one of the things you may have thought about in summary, that joy is a good way of thinking about the book of Philippians, because it's talked about in several places. The joy that we ought to have in our service, the joy that we ought to have in that partnership that fellowship that we have together in Christ. But I tend to think of affection, because almost every paragraph, every chapter here, the affection that Paul has for these people, not just when he's naming names and he's even applying corrective advice to them about, somebody help these people get along. Not even that, but that's done in a kind way. That's not even a scold. That's a mild scold at best. But to me, the underlying affection that Paul has for not just the group, the faceless group of people in Philippi, but those that he knows firsthand, those that he knows by names and had less long association with, that he continues to have affection for. And those relationships are the ones that are the very best in our lives, aren't they? The people that you've been on welcome speaking terms with for such a long time. The people where even if though some time may elapse between when you see them, you pick up where you left off. Isn't that the relationship that you see here? It's not just a casual relationship, or it's I love the church at Philippi. Paul's affection for, his concern, his mindfulness of the church at Philippi, they're just on the list of the people in this part of the country that he prays for regularly. I think it goes much deeper than that. I don't think we're at the point we could say that Philippi is his favorite church. But they're probably in the running, don't you think? Just from the evidence that we have here. And I'm not saying that, with Corinth had some real problems. And Paul and the church at Corinth had to work their way through their relationship, had to come some distance to be able to get to a point like this. But even if these are fragments of several letters, Paul's thread of affection for the Philippians is just prominent here. It stands out. It's amazing. And I'll touch on this just a minute. The generosity that Paul refers to the Macedonians in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, and that they are in fact cheerful givers, and they recognize that if you sow sparingly, you reap sparingly. That they recognize the import of their sacrifice, of their willingness, of their generosity. They understood the true power of that. And the language seems to suggest that this may be a more modest part of the country. That this isn't the thriving metropolis or the enjoying the opulence maybe of the capital cities, the big ports like Ephesus and Corinth. That maybe the expectations might have been low because it's maybe a more modest part of the country. Maybe it was a Roman colony, and several of these colonies were for Roman military people to retire to. Maybe it's a retirement community of sorts. That it's on the top 10 of places to retire to in the Roman Empire. And so maybe the expectations were that, as not having a lot of disposable income, that they wouldn't have the opportunity to be very generous. But yet Paul cites them as being the hallmark, because they gave themselves first to God. That's how he describes them, the church at Philippi, among the Macedonians, to the Philippians and all the other people that would receive the word of that. That their devotion to God was evident in not only their giving, but the attention that they had, the mindfulness in prayer, and how much Paul likes the fact that these people, he's raising them up in his prayers, and he knows that they're reciprocating, that they're remembering him in their prayers, and he craves that. He commends them for that. And that's this part of this relationship. Again, he says in verse 18, I'm amply supplied, or my needs are met. I've received full payment in the ESV and more, and being well supplied. That must have been a tremendous comfort to him in his circumstances. He goes on here in verse 21 and his final greetings, and mentions the brothers that are with him, and that could be fellow prisoners. but he mentions specifically those of Caesar's household. And the author here reminds us about the import of that. It's actually pretty good operational intelligence, if from a security guide. So that he not give a lot of details here, because outing these people and explaining that and naming people in Caesar's household who were faithful Christians might not have been a career-enhancing move for them, particularly when the official stance of the government was shifting pretty much against that. But to be literally under the nose in the tower of evil in the world as Nero's persecution begins to gain some steam, to have Christians in his household would certainly be something of at least a moral victory, if not an actual victory. And certainly that those people undoubtedly would have been encouraged to have become Christians because of the circumstances of Paul being in their midst. Paul's already demonstrated, he's already tried in his career, he's already tried to convert rulers. He's tried to convince the guards that are with him. He's the people that are responsible to him to take his advice and to listen and to heed his advice with regard to his shipwreck and the adventures that he had in even getting to Rome. But he's made an impression on him. He's made a dent even in Caesar's household of getting the message to them and some of them responding to it and being converted, which is no small thing. But he makes kind of a light, gives it a light touch, I think, here. But it's something, again, to draw a lot of encouragement from. It just kind of gives further credence to the charge that the Christians are those people that have overturned the world, those people that have upset everything everywhere, as the charge was made in Ephesus, have in fact even made an impact inside the household inside the government of the Roman Empire. That's, again, some of the fruits that can be born, or some of the benefit that would be accounted to those Christians in Philippi that had continued. They just started a partnership with Paul at their conversion, and it continued on it up to this day. I think I've touched on most of the things that the author did. Was there something that the author touched on that you wanted to pay particular attention to, or had a particular question about before we move into the reflective portion? Because I've done most of the talking here, and it's because I had some stuff that I really wanted to talk to you about. But I'm now at this point, I'm interested in not just your comments on my comments, but what your impressions were about having spent the last 13 weeks or so in this book. Leo? It could be that they stayed humble, that they were, and they never forgot where the church came from, what the occasion was for there to be a church in Philippi. Maybe that was something that those members and their leadership kept in front of them, just as a reminder that you shouldn't bypass Philippi because it didn't look like the prospects were very good. That when you meet someone and you consider talking to them about the gospel, you should have the same attitude that was used when Paul and his companions came to Philippi seeking those who were believers in God. I think that's useful, and not in the way the author makes use to the growth of the church, or look at what we've done and kind of a chest thumping. You look at what our efforts have yielded, and rather than recognizing the fact that God gives the increase, that these are God's fruits. This is the plan working exactly as God intended it for it to do, and we can enjoy this. We can enjoy these results when we follow His plan the way it was outlined. That it's useful for us to think about the beginnings, think about the folks that have gone before, that have got us to the point that we have the things that we enjoy here as part of the work. Those who have taught others, taught the people who are teachers now, who followed that model in 2 Timothy, the 2nd chapter, verse 2, about you who are faithful, find faithful men and teach them so that they can teach others. That you may think that it's, we've done a great job pulling ourselves up by our own bootstraps, but it's almost never that way. It's almost always built on the work and consideration and efforts of others. And being occasionally reminded of that is probably useful. It's probably humbling. And not only just to us individually, in thinking back, us individually in this congregation, but everyone here has a conversion story. Everyone here has a conversion story. Somebody took the time to share the gospel with you. Even if it was only an invitation to a Sunday night service, you started your journey somewhere. You may have been one of those rare individuals that just got up one day and you started wondering about things, and you started pulling on the thread until you unraveled the whole story. You didn't stop until you just dug in and figured it all out nearly on your own. Well, that's amazing. That's good. But I'm going to suggest that that's the rarity. Everybody had someone invite them to come and see. Examine for yourself. Consider the evidence and consider about Jesus. Come and see. That's the invitation. And so even if you don't think about the history of this congregation of in 1983, these 7 families that decided to begin meeting, establish a conservative work in Kingsport. That was, that's ancient history now, right? But that is in fact the humble beginning that this congregation and what we enjoy now came from. And it's good, I think, to remember that and to be encouraged by it, not to be puffed up, but to realize that it is by the work of others, by their grace, that we, in fact, many of us are here. But having gotten to the bell, I'm going to get Leslie's comment, and we'll do the contemplation. And it's not so much a mission accomplished. We're done. Good thing we put in all that work because we got where we intended. But we are, in fact, where we intended. Maybe not the way that we intended it, but we have arrived at this point because of all the things that we intended before it. The fellowship, the partnership that we started out with, we wouldn't have that now had we not started it. We wouldn't be enjoying being at this place without having put that previous work into the relationship. And to be thankful for it, to be, as you said, kind of a long thank you note on a cosmic scale, an eternal scale that he talks about, the things that we have to be thankful for. The fact that we have this relationship together in Christ is something to be thankful for. That we have this prospect of Christ living in us and Christ changing our lives, transforming our lives is all part of the plan, all part of what was intended. And we should be thankful for it. We shouldn't take it for granted. We should be anxious, continue to be anxious to share that with others, because that's part of the mission. That's also part of the plan. While we're enjoying those benefits of that and the good feelings that we have from that and the assurity and the closeness that we have as we've grown closer over the years and we've grown closer to God over the years, it's fitting for us to share in those fruits. and to be reminded of them, not that we're motivated by getting a higher score than someone else, or getting more jewels in our crown than our fellow brother, but rather realizing that it's the overall benefits that are coming from all of this. Paul's, I think, done a fabulous job of that, kind of zooming in and out, taking that global or eternal view and then putting wheels on it in how we behave every day and the attitudes that we have every day that could allow us to take joy, to have a life of service that is characterized by joy. And I got to tell you, this is a challenge for me. I'm sometimes overwhelmed by all the duties that Christ has charged us with. All the things, all the sin that we have to avoid, the example that we have to be, and we're always on duty, and we're our enemies, we're charged individually with escaping the traps that our enemy sets before us. All of that's overwhelming. And you can be so distracted by that we do lead this kind of a grudging walk toward our eternal salvation. As crazy as that sounds to put all those words together. If we lose, when we lose sight of that, it's easy to see how we would lose sight of joy. But keeping it in mind, keeping and realizing that our working the plan, our following the plan as it's been outlined, our faithful service to God has these results. Isn't not merely the salvation of ourselves, but the salvation of others, and God being glorified. And if we can keep those thoughts at hand, that we can achieve the kind of relationship with God as Christ's servants that the Philippians had together with Paul. That's a parting shot, is that you may not feel like this characterizes your life, but it can. God means for it to. And we need to recognize maybe we're the drag on that maybe it's to recognize our part and the relationship not being what it ought to, what God intends for it to be. And that's kind of a scold, but it's not meant to be. It's meant to be an encouragement, meant to be that God has so much better in mind for us. But we have to be willing to take hold of it. It's not gonna show up on your doorstep like a package from Amazon. Or it's unlikely to. Maybe it will, but it's unlikely to. Lesson's yours, and hope that it's been a fruitful study for you. I believe it has been. I've enjoyed it. I've benefited from it, and I hope that you have too. And on Eric's behalf, I have to thank you for all your wonderful contributions and participation in the class for the whole quarter. That's been a great encouragement.